Did you help out on Mbessa as lead before moving to Swarm? Mbessa was the last character I was involved with as champion lead before moving to Swarm. So there was definitely some things I helped out with, but that was a while ago. Hugh Quacks asked the question, I was always curious if Riot ever had the idea of using the same champ, but with alternative kits and art design in a similar vein of MTG when they have different versions of Planeswalkers with different abilities and drip. If possible, could you discuss the pros and cons of implementing such an idea? As always, love the stream. So we've done that. It's Yone. Yone very explicitly was a riff on Yasuo. It's like, hey, what about Yasuo's brother? And more deep into that, it was, hey, we have a character Yasuo. Players really, really love him. We don't have many characters like him. What if we, went out to explicitly create a character like him? But make it different. There used to be a joke that went around at the office that we should create Blue Yasuo. Blue Yasuo, the pitch was he's literally just Yasuo, except he's blue and he does magic damage instead of physical damage. And so the idea is that if you want to play Yasuo, but your team is all physical, instead of screwing over your team, you could pick Blue Yasuo, and then you'd have Blue Yasuo to play instead. And then the other joke was, it's just like, and then finally Yasuo's ban rate would go down because now you'd have to ban 2 Yasuos. Anyways, that itself is a silly idea, but Yone is an example of a character that we thought about, like, hey, people really like this champion Yasuo. If we were to riff on Yasuo in a different way, how could we do it? And so we worked on his brother, and there's a reason Yone's Q is very similar to Yasuo's Q. There's a reason that Senna has souls, just like Thresh. And that was because there was a bit of a riff on, like, hey, Thresh has the soul collecting gameplay. That seems really enjoyable. Let's see if we did that again. Could we do that again? Well, maybe it would make sense to do it on Senna, a character who's related to Thresh in the lore, and she would have a different way to do it. That said, the question more focused on what about champions or just alternative art and alternate designs? There was a pitch a long time ago for young Zilean. The idea is that we wouldn't delete Zilean from the game, but we would just make Zilean when he was like a young adult, and it would just be another guy that had time powers, because, Zilean's got time powers, so it kind of made sense. But I'd say one of the things is we kind of like characters in a game to be kind of consistent with who they are. It's like if you're playing against Jinx, you're playing against Jinx, and you don't really need to learn like what Jinx 1 or Jinx 2 is, if that makes sense. And so oftentimes it's also a question of trade-offs in terms of, hey, do we want to make another Jinx? Like in Magic, you use the versions of Planeswalkers in Magic as an example. One of the things about the versions of Planeswalkers in Magic is it's relatively cheap to create them, right? You can make a lot of different Planeswalkers. In League, making a new champion is a lot of work. And so it's one of the things that is the trade-off of, if you're going to make a new character, should you make a new character that has different themes and different abilities and speaks to a different audience of people? Or should you make the same old character, and of course with different spells, right? And oftentimes the answer would be like, well, probably the new character expanding the roster in that way is probably better off. So that's kind of the idea there. So, sorry, I've rambled a bit on this one, but TLDR it's definitely something we've chatted about in the past. It's definitely something that, maybe could happen at some point. Characters like Yone are a more abstract version of creating like a similar version of an old character, but generally, at least in a game like League, it tends to be more worth the effort to make new characters and new stories as opposed to riff on the old story with a new champion who's, Jin 2 or Jin 4. How much does potential toxicity come up in champ design? The obvious example is Draven passive or support stealing kills. Champs that executes 100% getting the kill gold. Champion toxicity comes up a lot, actually. Contrary to popular belief, we care a lot about a character feeling good to play with and good to play against. I know some of you are going to flame me for that one. You're going to be like, Lamau. But it's a real thing. We care about... And generally in games, you care about like how characters feel to play as and play against. And so a question I often ask if I'm making, let's say, a toxic ability, like you mentioned Draven passive, where Draven's passive kind of makes him yell at people because he's like, you stole my kill, in a way that other characters don't do, is it's kind of always the question of, well, is this negative feeling that it's creating worth the upsides? Because for anything we're doing, there's someone having a good time, and then there's maybe someone having a less good time, right? And that's the end of the day. In order to have a pop-off game as Yasuo, you're probably making someone feel a little bad. In order to have a pop-off game as Jinx, you're probably making someone feel a little bad, right? And so the question is, are those awesome, exciting moments that make you really want to play League worth the costs, right? Games like Dota, they have similar stuff where like there's characters in Dota who are legit very, very, very frustrating. And one of the things Dota often does to talk about like making it worth the cost is like, well, if there's a frustrating thing that's going on, here's how you potentially could have beaten it. Dota has a lot of counter matchups as an example. And so, oh, you're mad that Rikimaru was running around invisible and stabbing you to death? Well, did you try buying Dust? Did you try locking in Slarter, right? There's a number of things in Dota that have like, hey, here's this frustrating thing that happened and here's what you could do against it. And that's one of the things we also think about in League of Legends. We're less about like hard counters through items or champion picks, but more about just counterplay in general, right? So it's like, here's all these frustrating things that Yasuo is doing to you. Here's all the things that you can do potentially against him to mitigate that frustration. We think is an important loop there. In regards to Draven's passive we feel is worth the thematic gains. Because Draven passive, even though it does create some toxicity of like, you know, hey, you stole my kill, I'm going to int you now. It also like really, really plays into who Draven is as a character and the type of people who want to play Draven, right? The type of people who want to play Draven generally think they're better than you, right? It takes that type of person to even want to play that kit that's all about early lane dominance and catching axes and flare and things like that. And so the thing about Draven passive is, well, it does have this downside of creating some tension between teammates when in regards to kill steals. It also just directly slots into who Draven is as a character thematically and who Draven is as a character for the type of people who would want to pick him. And so we generally feel that's worth some of those downsides that they have to take on to play it. So it's kind of idea there. But yeah, if I was to summarize this question, the toxic things that a character does, the hope is that they are worth it. The hope is that you've created a character who has enough downsides in other places and enough upside from that toxic thing that it ends up being worth what that character is. Yasuo's Wind Wall is something that tends to be very frustrating, but tends to also make Yasuo function in the exact ways he needs to be Yasuo. It lets him deal with AD carries while still interacting with the front line without having to be as feast or famine as a character like Master Yi. And then it also doesn't give him power to just stomp on his melee matchups, which also tends to be like a healthy thing in general. So Yasuo's Wind Wall, while frustrating, we tend to find is very, very worth the other gameplay outcomes it creates for the character.